Sometimes the greatest miracle doesn't happen when you open the right door. It happens when life quietly leads you to the wrong one. The elevator climbed in perfect silence, gliding toward the 47th floor of one of Manhattan's most exclusive residential towers while Ethan Calloway stared at the polished steel doors without really seeing his reflection. At 42, he had built a business empire worth billions of dollars, negotiated deals that reshaped skylines across America, and learned how to hide exhaustion behind a calm smile that convinced everyone he had everything under control. Almost everyone. His 8-year-old daughter, Lily, was the only person who still recognized the quiet sadness behind his eyes. Ever since her mother passed away 3 years earlier, Ethan had measured success differently. Profit margins no longer mattered as much as bedtime stories, pancakes on Saturday mornings, and hearing Lily laugh from the back seat of his SUV. The penthouse waiting above was supposed to be another fresh start. His attorneys had handled every detail while he attended meetings in Chicago, signed documents electronically, and trusted that one more luxury property would simply become another investment in an already crowded portfolio. He had never even toured the place. 47th floor, the elevator chimed softly. The doors opened onto a private marble foyer washed in warm afternoon sunlight pouring through floor-to-ceiling windows at the end of the hallway. The air smelled faintly of fresh coffee and vanilla, not the sterile emptiness Ethan expected from an unoccupied residence. He slowed his pace. Someone must have left the building's staging lights on, he thought. His leather shoes echoed gently against the polished stone as he reached the oversized walnut door. He checked the suite number once, then twice. It matched the purchase agreement perfectly. He slid the new brass key into the lock. Click. The deadbolt turned smoothly. He pushed the door open. Instead of silence, he heard soft humming. Instead of an empty penthouse, he caught the comforting scent of warm cinnamon drifting through the open living room. Instead of expensive furniture wrapped in protective plastic, fresh flowers rested on a dining table beside an open sketchbook. Ethan stopped moving. In the bright kitchen beyond the living room, a young woman stood barefoot on a small step stool reaching for a ceramic mug from the highest cabinet. Her cream-colored sweater sleeves were rolled to her elbows, and loose strands of blonde hair escaped a simple ponytail as sunlight surrounded her like a quiet morning painting. She turned casually at the sound of the opening door and smiled with complete innocence. "Oh, perfect," she said warmly. "The grocery delivery's earlier than I expected." Then she looked more carefully. The smile disappeared. The mug slipped slightly in her hands but did not fall. Ethan remained frozen near the doorway, one hand still resting on the handle. "I'm sorry," he said calmly. "I believe this is my penthouse." The young woman blinked once, then slowly shook her head. "No," she answered almost in a whisper. "This has been my home." Neither of them raised their voices. Neither of them moved closer. Between them stretched a beautiful apartment filled with afternoon light and a silence that somehow felt louder than any argument. Ethan glanced toward the framed family photographs resting on the bookshelf, the knitted blanket folded neatly across the sofa, and the small watercolor painting of Central Park hanging above the fireplace. None of it looked temporary. None of it looked staged. Every corner carried the unmistakable warmth of someone who truly belonged there. For the first time in years, the billionaire who never questioned contracts began wondering whether a signature on paper could ever tell the whole truth. Somewhere deep inside the apartment, a vintage clock chimed 3 gentle notes. Outside, New York continued rushing through another ordinary afternoon. But inside that penthouse, behind the wrong door, 2 strangers had just stepped into the first page of a story neither of them could have imagined. Claire lowered the ceramic mug onto the kitchen counter with slow, careful hands, as though one sudden movement might shatter far more than porcelain. She looked around the apartment she had come to know by heart, then back at the man standing quietly inside the doorway. His tailored charcoal suit, polished shoes, and calm posture suggested confidence, but there was something unexpectedly gentle in his expression that made him seem more tired than intimidating. Ethan slipped a folded copy of the purchase agreement from the leather portfolio tucked beneath his arm. He did not wave it like a weapon. He simply glanced at it before looking back at her. "I purchased this property 3 days ago," he said evenly. "At least that is what every document says." Claire swallowed softly. "Then every document is missing part of the story." Silence settled over the room again. Outside, sunlight reflected off neighboring skyscrapers, sending ribbons of gold across the hardwood floor. A coffee maker clicked softly as it finished brewing another pot. The apartment felt impossibly peaceful for two strangers standing on opposite sides of a life-changing misunderstanding. Claire took a slow breath. "Would you like some coffee?" she asked. Ethan looked slightly surprised. "You are offering coffee to someone who just walked into your home claiming he owns it?" A faint smile touched her face for only a moment. "It usually helps people listen before they decide." Ethan nodded once. "Coffee sounds reasonable." A few minutes later they sat across from one another at the dining table. Between them rested 2 steaming mugs, a small plate of blueberry muffins, and paperwork that suddenly seemed far less certain than either of them expected. Claire folded her hands together. "My grandmother worked here for almost 30 years as the personal assistant to Mr. Arthur Whitmore." Ethan recognized the name immediately. Arthur Whitmore had quietly become one of New York's most respected real estate investors before passing away nearly a year earlier. "After he died," Claire continued, "his attorneys told me I could remain here until his estate was completely settled. They said everything would take time because several properties were tied up in legal reviews." Ethan listened without interrupting. That habit had made him successful long before his fortune ever did. Claire reached toward a wooden box resting on a nearby shelf and carefully removed a neatly organized stack of letters. Some were handwritten. Others carried official law firm letterheads. She slid them gently across the table. Ethan examined each page carefully. The signatures appeared authentic. The dates stretched back nearly 10 months. Nothing looked fabricated. If anything, the paperwork created more questions than answers. "No one ever contacted you?" Ethan asked quietly. Claire shook her head. "No phone calls. No emails. Nothing. I thought the estate was still being reviewed." Ethan leaned back slowly. His instincts, sharpened by decades of negotiations worth hundreds of millions of dollars, whispered that something about this transaction felt wrong. Someone had moved unusually fast. Someone had overlooked records that should never have been overlooked. Before he could respond, the apartment doorbell chimed gently. Claire excused herself and opened the door to reveal Lily standing beside the building concierge, clutching her favorite backpack with both hands. Her bright blue eyes immediately wandered past Claire toward the apartment. "Daddy," she called curiously. Ethan stood and smiled for the first time that afternoon. "Come here, sweetheart." Lily hurried across the room before stopping beside Claire. She looked up with the honest curiosity only children possess. "Do you live here?" Claire nodded. "I thought I did." Lily frowned thoughtfully, then looked at her father. "Can 2 people accidentally belong to the same home?" Ethan opened his mouth, searching for an answer that contracts and accountants had never taught him. Before he could find one, Claire quietly replied, "Maybe sometimes people find the right place before they understand why." Lily smiled as if that answer made perfect sense. Ethan looked from his daughter to the woman across the room and realized the most expensive purchase of his life had suddenly become the one thing money alone could not explain. The following morning arrived wrapped in the soft silver glow of early autumn, and Manhattan seemed unusually quiet from 47 floors above the streets below. Thin clouds drifted between towers of glass, while the first rays of sunlight painted long reflections across the penthouse windows. Ethan stood alone beside the living room overlooking Central Park, a warm cup of black coffee untouched in his hand. During 3 decades in business he had trusted contracts, numbers, and carefully reviewed documents. Yet none of those things explained why every instinct told him Claire had been telling the truth. Behind him, the gentle sound of dishes being placed into a cabinet mixed with the faint melody Claire hummed while preparing breakfast. It sounded less like someone protecting property and more like someone simply living another ordinary morning. Lily wandered into the kitchen wearing oversized socks and carrying the stuffed rabbit she had slept with since she was 4 years old. Her hair was still slightly messy, and her sleepy smile brightened the room before anyone spoke a word. "Good morning," Claire said cheerfully as she slid a plate of blueberry pancakes onto the island. "I hope you both like cinnamon." Lily's eyes grew wide. "Daddy never remembers cinnamon." Ethan raised an eyebrow with a playful smile. "I remember it. I just forget to buy it." Lily giggled and climbed onto one of the bar stools. Within minutes, the three of them were sharing breakfast in a dining room that somehow no longer felt divided by uncertainty. The conversation stayed simple. Favorite books. The view from the windows. Whether New York looked prettier after rain or after snow. Claire listened more than she spoke, asking Lily thoughtful questions and laughing softly whenever the little girl described school with dramatic seriousness. Ethan found himself watching instead of eating. He noticed the way Claire always looked directly at Lily when she answered, making the child feel heard. He noticed how naturally she reached to straighten a crooked napkin or refill a glass before anyone asked. Small gestures. Quiet gestures. The kind that never appeared in board meetings but somehow mattered much more. After breakfast, Ethan excused himself to make several calls from the study. His legal team answered almost immediately. "I want every document connected to the Whitmore estate reviewed." Again, he instructed calmly. "Every transfer, every signature, every approval. Assume nothing." His attorney sounded surprised. "Is there a problem with the property?" Ethan looked through the glass wall toward Claire helping Lily assemble a 500-piece puzzle on the living room rug. The two of them were already laughing over pieces that looked almost identical. "I believe there may be a much bigger problem than the property," he replied before ending the call. Hours slipped by more quickly than expected. Claire showed Lily an old watercolor set she had found tucked inside one of Arthur Whitmore's storage cabinets years earlier. Together they painted skylines filled with impossible colors, purple rivers, golden clouds, and emerald rooftops. Ethan quietly watched from across the room while answering emails that suddenly felt far less important than they had the previous afternoon. For the first time in years, work did not demand every corner of his attention. Around noon, Lily proudly held up her painting. It showed 3 people standing beneath one enormous apartment window watching the sunset together. "Who are they?" Ethan asked gently. Lily studied the picture for a moment. "I do not know yet," she answered honestly. "I just think they are supposed to meet." Claire lowered her paintbrush, unexpectedly touched by the innocent answer. Before anyone could speak again, Ethan's phone vibrated across the coffee table. The message came directly from his lead attorney. 3 short sentences appeared on the screen. "We found inconsistencies in the closing documents. The sale should never have been finalized. Someone accelerated the transfer without authorization." Ethan slowly lowered the phone. Outside, the city continued its endless rhythm, unaware that inside one quiet penthouse, the first crack had finally appeared in a mystery much larger than a mistaken address. Late that afternoon, the golden light began stretching across the hardwood floors, softening every corner of the penthouse until the apartment felt less like a luxury residence and more like a place where memories quietly lived. Ethan stood beside the tall windows with his phone resting silently in his pocket. His attorney's message refused to leave his mind. Someone had pushed the property transfer through without proper authorization. It was no longer a simple misunderstanding. It was a carefully overlooked truth waiting to be uncovered. Claire noticed the thoughtful look on his face as she gathered the watercolor supplies from the coffee table. "Your lawyers found something," she said gently. It was not a question. Ethan nodded. They believe the sale should never have closed. Claire lowered her eyes for a moment, not in relief but in sadness. Then Mr. Whitmore was right. Ethan turned toward her. What do you mean? Claire walked slowly toward a narrow hallway leading to the library. There is something I have never shown anyone. She stopped beside an old walnut bookshelf built into the wall. Unlike the modern furniture surrounding it, this piece carried decades of careful use. Running her fingers along the edge, she pressed against a carved wooden panel almost hidden by the grain. A quiet click echoed through the room. Ethan watched as a narrow compartment opened behind several books. Inside rested a faded leather journal, a brass key attached to a blue ribbon, and a small envelope with Arthur Whitmore's unmistakable handwriting across the front. Claire carefully picked up the journal before handing the sealed envelope to Ethan. He told me to keep these safe, she whispered. He said if anyone ever questioned why I was here, the answers would arrive when the right person finally asked the right questions. Ethan looked down at the envelope. His own name was nowhere on it. Instead, it simply read, "To the person willing to value truth above ownership." He slowly unfolded the letter. Arthur's handwriting was steady despite his advanced age. If you are reading this, then events have unfolded differently than I hoped. This apartment was never meant to become another transaction. It was meant to protect someone who had already lost too much. Ethan paused, glancing toward Claire. She stood quietly beside the bookshelf, her hands folded together, allowing the words to speak before she did. The letter continued. Claire Bennett entered my life at 17 after losing both of her parents within the same year. She never asked me for money. She asked for purpose. She helped organize my correspondence, read to me when my eyesight faded, and reminded an old man that kindness still existed. I promised she would always have a home until my affairs were honestly settled. Ethan folded the letter carefully. The silence that followed carried far more weight than any courtroom testimony could have held. Claire smiled faintly, though her eyes glistened with emotion. He was never family by blood, she said softly. But he treated me like I mattered. Lily wandered into the library carrying her stuffed rabbit. She looked from Ethan to Claire, sensing the quiet seriousness without fully understanding it. Was Mr. Whitmore your grandpa? She asked. Claire knelt until they were eye level. Not exactly, she answered. But sometimes life lets wonderful people become family anyway. Lily nodded with complete acceptance. That makes sense. Children rarely needed complicated explanations for simple truths. Ethan looked around the library with new eyes. Every framed photograph, every carefully arranged book, every handwritten note tucked between shelves suddenly carried a deeper meaning. This apartment had never been about expensive marble, skyline views, or market value. It had become a sanctuary built from gratitude, loyalty, and promises that someone had tried to erase with paperwork. As evening settled over Manhattan and thousands of city lights flickered to life beyond the glass, Ethan quietly slipped Arthur Whitmore's letter back into its envelope. At that moment he no longer wondered who truly belonged inside the penthouse. Instead, one far more troubling question settled into his heart. If someone had worked this hard to force Claire out, what secret inside these walls were they so desperate to hide? The following morning carried a different kind of silence. It was no longer the peaceful quiet of strangers learning to trust one another. It was the silence that arrives just before hidden truths begin finding their own voice. Ethan's legal team occupied the dining table with neatly organized folders, digital tablets, and copies of property records stretching back nearly 15 years. Through the towering windows, New York shimmered beneath a crisp blue sky, but inside the penthouse every page seemed heavier than the last. Ethan stood with his hands resting lightly against the back of a chair while his senior attorney, Margaret Collins, adjusted her glasses and looked toward him with unusual concern. We have confirmed that someone bypassed multiple estate review procedures, she said. The signatures authorizing the accelerated transfer were genuine, but the supporting approvals were inserted afterward. Whoever arranged this knew exactly how the system worked. Ethan remained calm. Can you identify who benefited? Margaret hesitated. Not yet. But this transaction was never about selling luxury real estate. Someone wanted this apartment occupied by a new legal owner as quickly as possible. Claire listened quietly from the library entrance, Arthur Whitmore's journal resting carefully against her chest. The words echoed through her thoughts. Someone wanted this apartment occupied. Not sold. Occupied. Lily sat cross-legged on the living room rug assembling the last pieces of yesterday's puzzle, blissfully unaware that the adults were trying to solve one far more complicated. Ethan thanked his attorneys before asking them to continue their investigation privately. Once they left, the apartment settled into another thoughtful stillness. Claire slowly placed the leather journal onto the dining table. There is something I never understood, she admitted. Mr. Whitmore always insisted that I memorize where everything belonged in this apartment. Every book. Every painting. Every piece of furniture. I thought he simply liked order. Ethan looked around the room. His eyes stopped on a large landscape painting hanging above the fireplace. Did anything ever change? Claire considered the question before shaking her head. Never. Even when the furniture was replaced, that painting always stayed exactly where it is. Ethan walked toward it. The artwork itself was beautiful, a peaceful autumn lake surrounded by golden maple trees reflecting beneath a cloudless sky. Yet Arthur Whitmore had owned countless valuable paintings. Why insist on this particular one remaining untouched? Ethan gently examined the frame without removing it. His fingers traced the carved walnut edge until they paused over a tiny engraved mark almost invisible beneath decades of polish. 2 letters. A W. Claire's expression changed instantly. I have never noticed that. Before either of them could study it further, the apartment doorbell sounded. 3 calm chimes echoed through the hallway. Claire opened the door to find a well-dressed man carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the practiced smile of someone accustomed to expensive negotiations. Good afternoon, he said pleasantly. My name is Daniel Mercer. I represent the Whitmore Estate Transition Group. I understand there has been some confusion regarding this residence. Ethan stepped forward before Claire could answer. Confusion is one word for it. Mercer maintained his polite smile. Our clients would like to resolve this matter quickly. Mr. Calloway, if you are willing to transfer ownership back through our office, every expense will be reimbursed immediately. In addition, you will receive a generous premium for your cooperation. Ethan studied the man carefully. You are offering me millions of dollars to give back a property I purchased less than a week ago? We simply wish to avoid unnecessary legal complications. Ethan glanced briefly toward Claire before returning his attention to Mercer. Interesting. His voice remained calm, almost conversational. Because until this moment, I believed everyone wanted me to keep it. For the first time, Daniel Mercer's confident smile faltered. It lasted only a second, but Ethan noticed it. Years of negotiating billion-dollar agreements had taught him that the smallest hesitation often revealed the biggest secret. As Mercer quietly excused himself with promises to call again, Ethan closed the apartment door and looked toward the painting above the fireplace. The offer had confirmed what his instincts had been whispering since the day he opened the wrong door. The penthouse itself had never been the prize. Whatever someone was desperately trying to recover was still hidden inside these walls. That evening, rain drifted softly against the towering windows, turning the Manhattan skyline into a watercolor of silver lights and blurred reflections. The penthouse felt wrapped inside its own quiet world while the city hurried through another busy night below. Ethan stood alone before the painting above the fireplace, studying every carved detail of its wooden frame. The tiny engraved letter that Claire had never noticed continued to occupy his thoughts. Arthur Whitmore had been far too careful to leave meaningless clues. He believed in intention. Every decision carried purpose. Every promise carried responsibility. Claire entered the living room carrying 3 mugs of hot chocolate instead of coffee. She handed one to Lily before offering another to Ethan. "You have been staring at that painting for almost an hour," she said with a gentle smile. Ethan accepted the mug with quiet gratitude. "I keep asking myself the same question. Which one? Why would someone spend millions of dollars trying to recover one apartment unless something inside it mattered even more?" Claire glanced toward the peaceful landscape hanging above the fireplace. "Arthur always told me that people who chase wealth often overlook the things that cannot be bought." Ethan smiled faintly. "He sounds like someone I wish I had known." Lily climbed onto the sofa hugging her stuffed rabbit. "Maybe he knew you anyway," she said. Ethan looked toward his daughter. "What makes you say that?" She shrugged with complete innocence. "Because he left clues for somebody nice enough to help Claire." Neither adult answered immediately. Sometimes children reached truths that logic took years to discover. Ethan walked slowly across the room and carefully lifted the painting from its hook. Claire instinctively stepped closer to help support the frame. Together they set it gently on a thick wool rug. Behind it, the wall appeared completely ordinary except for a narrow rectangle where the paint reflected light differently than the surrounding surface. Ethan ran his fingertips across the drywall until he felt the slightest change in texture. "There," he whispered. Claire looked closer. Hidden almost perfectly within the molding was a tiny brass keyhole no larger than a shirt button. Her eyes widened. The key. She hurried toward the library and returned carrying the blue ribbon that still held Arthur Whitmore's old brass key. Her hands trembled slightly as she passed it to Ethan. He paused before inserting it into the lock. "If this opens something," he said quietly, "whatever we find belongs to the truth, not to me." Claire met his eyes with grateful respect. That is exactly what Arthur hoped someone would say. Ethan gently turned the key. A soft mechanical click echoed inside the wall. Slowly, a narrow panel released, revealing a hidden compartment no deeper than a few inches. Inside rested a single leather document case and a small velvet box. No stacks of cash. No jewelry. No priceless artwork. Just 2 carefully protected items waiting patiently through the years. Claire stared silently. "He never told me this existed." Ethan carefully removed the document case and placed it on the coffee table without opening it immediately. Something about Arthur Whitmore's quiet preparation deserved patience instead of excitement. Before anyone reached for the clasp, Ethan's telephone vibrated across the table. Margaret Collins was calling again. He answered immediately. "Margaret." Her normally composed voice carried unmistakable urgency. "Ethan, I need you to listen carefully. Daniel Mercer does not work for the Whitmore estate. We verified it an hour ago. The organization he mentioned does not legally exist. Someone created it only 6 months ago using shell companies." Ethan's expression grew thoughtful rather than fearful. "So he was never trying to settle the estate?" "No," Margaret replied. "He was trying to reach whatever Arthur Whitmore left behind before anyone else found it." Ethan slowly looked down at the unopened leather case resting between himself and Claire. Outside, thunder rolled gently beyond the skyline, followed by another curtain of rain washing across the city lights. Inside the quiet penthouse, no one spoke for several long moments. They all understood the same truth now. Ethan had never accidentally purchased the wrong home. Somehow, without knowing it, he had arrived exactly when Arthur Whitmore had always believed the right person finally would. Morning arrived with crystal clear skies after the night's rain, and the city sparkled beneath the fresh sunlight as though every rooftop had been quietly polished before dawn. Inside the penthouse, however, no one hurried toward breakfast. The leather document case remained exactly where Ethan had placed it on the coffee table, untouched, carrying a strange kind of gravity that drew every eye in the room. Lily sat quietly beside the window reading one of Arthur Whitmore's old children's books while Claire stood near the fireplace, her fingers gently wrapped around a warm mug of tea. Ethan finally stepped forward and rested one hand on the worn leather case. Arthur trusted that whoever opened this would choose integrity over convenience, he said softly. We owe him that much. Claire nodded. Whatever is inside belongs to the truth. Ethan carefully released the brass clasp. The lid opened with a faint creak, revealing several neatly organized folders, a small flash drive sealed inside a protective envelope, and another handwritten letter. There were no diamonds, no stock certificates worth billions, nothing that resembled hidden treasure. Instead, there were records. Decades of records. Ethan removed the first folder and slowly turned its pages. Financial statements. Property acquisitions. Charitable foundation reports. At first glance everything appeared ordinary, but the deeper he read, the more unusual the pattern became. Arthur Whitmore had quietly transferred ownership of dozens of affordable housing properties into non-profit trusts years before his death. Those properties had generated only modest profits but had provided thousands of families with stable homes across New York and neighboring states. Claire leaned closer. He never talked about any of this. Ethan continued reading until one page stopped him completely. Several signatures approving the non-profit transfers had been replaced in newer digital filings with completely different ownership records. Entire neighborhoods had quietly been redirected toward private investment companies. Margaret Collins arrived less than an hour later carrying her laptop and a portable document scanner. Ethan handed her the files without a word. She compared them against official digital archives, her expression becoming more serious with every passing minute. Finally she looked up. These originals prove someone altered the estate records after Mr. Whitmore passed away. If these documents are authentic, hundreds of families could have lost long-term housing protections without ever knowing why. Claire covered her mouth in disbelief. That was the promise he cared about most. Margaret nodded slowly. And someone appears to have spent months trying to erase that promise. Ethan reached for the sealed envelope containing the flash drive. Written across the front were only 6 simple words. If paper fails, truth remembers here. Margaret inserted the drive into her encrypted laptop. A secure archive opened immediately. Video messages. Scanned contracts. Audio recordings. Every important agreement Arthur Whitmore had ever discussed concerning the charitable properties had been carefully preserved with dates, witnesses, and legal confirmations. One final video file appeared at the bottom of the screen. Arthur himself filled the display, sitting in the same library where they now stood. Though older and visibly tired, his eyes remained warm and steady. If you are watching this, he began with a gentle smile, then someone has mistaken wealth for ownership. Real wealth has never been measured by buildings. It has always been measured by the lives sheltered inside them. If these records are needed, it means promises are being rewritten by people who believe signatures matter more than character. Do not hate them. Simply bring the truth into the light. Truth has a remarkable habit of defending itself. The room remained completely still after the recording ended. Even Lily quietly closed her book, sensing the importance of what had just unfolded. Ethan looked toward Claire. He trusted you because you protected his kindness. Then he looked at Margaret. How long before we can restore these records? Margaret smiled for the first time that day. With these originals, not long. Ethan gently closed the document case and looked once more across the apartment that had changed every part of his understanding. He had spent years building towers that reached into the clouds, yet an old man's quiet promise hidden behind one painting had reminded him that the strongest foundations were never poured in concrete. They were built in honesty, compassion, and the courage to protect people who could never repay the favor. Over the next several days, the quiet truth Arthur Whitmore had protected for so many years began finding its way into the hands of the people who had been searching for it with honesty instead of ambition. Margaret Collins worked alongside independent auditors, estate specialists, and non-profit attorneys, comparing every original document from the hidden archive against the altered digital records. Each verified page strengthened the same conclusion. The charitable housing trusts Arthur had created had never legally been dissolved. They had simply been buried beneath carefully layered paperwork designed to redirect ownership toward private investment groups. The evidence was clear. It did not need dramatic speeches. It only needed daylight. Ethan watched the process unfold from the Penthouse conference room, where legal files now covered the dining table that had recently held blueberry pancakes and watercolor paintings. The contrast made him smile. Life had a curious way of reminding people what truly mattered. Claire spent most of her mornings helping organize Arthur's handwritten journals. She recognized names, dates, and personal notes that transformed cold legal records into stories of real families. One elderly couple had written Arthur every Christmas for 12 years because affordable rent had allowed them to remain close to their grandchildren. A single mother had enclosed a crayon drawing from her little boy thanking Mr. Whitmore for giving them a safe place to sleep. Claire quietly placed each letter beside the matching property file. "These are the real records," she whispered. "Not numbers. People." Ethan looked at her with growing admiration. "You understand his legacy better than anyone." Late one afternoon, Margaret arrived carrying a folder marked Final Review. She set it carefully onto the coffee table before smiling with quiet satisfaction. "The court has accepted the original documentation. The fraudulent transfers are being reversed. Every protected housing trust will remain exactly as Arthur intended." Claire closed her eyes for a brief moment, breathing deeply as years of uncertainty finally began lifting from her shoulders. Ethan noticed that she did not celebrate with excitement. Instead, she simply looked toward the library where Arthur had spent so many peaceful afternoons. Gratitude, he realized, was often much quieter than victory. A week later, Daniel Mercer voluntarily withdrew every remaining claim connected to the apartment after investigators confirmed that the shell companies linked to the altered filings could no longer support ownership claims once the authentic records surfaced. Ethan never spoke to Mercer again. There was no satisfaction in watching someone lose influence. Arthur's final message had remained with him. Do not hate them. Simply bring the truth into the light. One rainy evening, after the legal work had finally slowed, Lily invited Claire into the living room to finish the 500-piece puzzle they had started days earlier. Only one piece remained. Claire searched carefully across the table but could not find it. Lily smiled mischievously before reaching into the pocket of her sweater. "I was saving the last one," she admitted. Together they placed it into the center of the picture. The image was complete at last. 3 people stood beneath one enormous apartment window watching the sunset together. Ethan looked at the finished puzzle and laughed softly. "You planned that from the beginning, did not you?" Lily shrugged with the innocent confidence only children possess. "Sometimes you have to wait until everybody is ready." Claire felt unexpected tears warming her eyes. She quickly smiled through them before looking out across the glowing Manhattan skyline. The city appeared exactly as it had the day Ethan first opened the wrong door, yet everything inside. The apartment had changed. The fear had become trust. The uncertainty had become purpose. The stranger who once offered him coffee now felt as familiar as the evening light filling the room. Ethan quietly realized that Arthur Whitmore had protected far more than documents hidden behind a wall. Without ever meeting him, the old man had quietly restored something Ethan believed he had lost forever after his wife's passing. Hope had not arrived through wealth, contracts, or perfect planning. It had arrived through kindness, patience, and one unexpected knock on the wrong door. 1 year later, the first morning of October arrived with crisp air drifting through the slightly open balcony doors, carrying the familiar scent of autumn leaves and distant rain. The city below moved with its usual energy, yellow taxis weaving through Manhattan while the first sunlight stretched across the skyline in ribbons of gold. Yet inside the penthouse, life unfolded at a gentler rhythm. The dining table was no longer covered with legal files or unanswered questions. Instead, it held fresh flowers, a basket of warm cinnamon rolls, 3 steaming mugs, and a small stack of Lily's newest watercolor paintings. Ethan stood at the kitchen counter preparing breakfast with a confidence that had nothing to do with boardrooms or billion-dollar negotiations. He had reduced his work schedule months earlier, handing daily operations to trusted executives so he could spend more mornings at home than in airports. Success, he had discovered, sounded much quieter than applause. It sounded like laughter drifting through a peaceful apartment before 8 o'clock in the morning. Claire stepped into the kitchen carrying Arthur Whitmore's leather journal, now carefully restored and preserved inside a protective case. She smiled as Ethan slid a plate of pancakes onto the table. "You remembered the cinnamon," she teased gently. Ethan laughed. "I finally learned my lesson." Lily rushed into the room with her backpack bouncing against her shoulders. At 9 years old she seemed taller every week, but her bright blue eyes still carried the same warmth that had quietly connected 3 strangers on an unforgettable afternoon. She placed a handmade card beside Arthur's journal. The front read simply, "Thank you." Claire opened it carefully. Inside was a watercolor painting of a large apartment window overlooking the city. 3 figures stood together watching the sunset, just like the puzzle Lily had finished months before. Above them, written in careful handwriting, were the words, "Home is where kindness stays." Claire blinked away grateful tears before hugging Lily tightly. Ethan looked toward the library where Arthur's favorite chair still rested beside the window exactly as he had always kept it. They had decided never to replace it. Some memories deserved space to keep speaking. A gentle knock sounded at the apartment door. Margaret Collins stepped inside carrying a single envelope. "Everything has been finalized," she announced with a warm smile. "The housing trusts have all been permanently secured under independent non-profit protection exactly as Mr. Whitmore intended. Every famil